Welcome to the podcast Scattered, one person's search for the story behind human remains. My name is Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical anthropologist and archaeologist. In other words, I like dead people. In this podcast, I explore topics related to dead people, from searching for human remains in forensic contexts to mortuary practices in modern and archaeological contexts, and everything in between. I offer information, perspectives, and insights directly from the mouths of researchers, as well as experiences of people who work with remains. All of this aims to provide you with information on subjects that aren't really talked about, don't seem to be a priority, or they can be very misunderstood. I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to the Scattered Podcast. I hope you are well on this, for me, what is a fine early autumn day. It is September 15th as I'm recording this, and the leaves are turning. I see golden leaves outside my window. This is my favorite time of year, minus the start of the school season, which always has people in a tizzy. And when other people are in a tizzy, that means I get anxious. So it's just the nature of who I am. I'm an introvert and a neurodivergent, so other people's anxiety tends to rub off on me, and I want to escape from that. So what has been going on here before we get into the interview with Janet Young? I started working finally a year later on the Saskatchewan videos for the scavenging study. We only had 2 sites in 2022 through to 2023, and we collected those last year, collected the remains. And so I need to make up videos for those. I made up the first one, the forested or closed canopy site, but I have kind of stalled on the open one because Shari is still holding some of the video for that. I wasn't out there for the setup, but I was out there for the collection, and so I'm relying upon her for the videos of the setup, and she's got them all at the moment. So we're arranging a meetup where we can exchange some stuff, and I will get those videos and then get that final video out soon. Until then, yes, the forest video is up. If you're curious, go to yvonnechorlin.com/scavenging-study to check those out. The mapping video that I have promised, because back in July, I think some of you will remember that I went out with the RCMP near Edmonton to try to figure out a method to map the scatter of remains that may replace my very old school method of using just a cloth measuring tape. So just a measuring tape, old-fashioned measuring tape, it's I think 60 meters long, and I roll it up on a big roll. And that's how I would measure the scatter, how far remains scatter from the original deposition point. And I thought, you know what, this is taking me way too long. It's not exactly accurate, and there's got to be another way. So after much searching, I found somebody in the RCMP just outside of Edmonton, and they said, okay, let's try this. Let's go out and play. So they had a total station. They had a drone with a fantastic camera, and we met up at the end of July, and we hopefully found a method that works, that is not going to involve me using a cloth tape measure. So I took a bunch of video, took a bunch of pictures, and I documented hopefully the entire process, most of it anyway, and I've got the resulting images from that RCMP member, and I'm hoping to compile a big video about the method that we used to map the remains. As well, that would have a bunch of added value stuff like the drone took a bunch of pictures, and so we overlaid the measurements on top of those pictures to then kind of sort of get a Google Earth type image of the surroundings. So if there's a water body or a road or a trail or there's a change in vegetation, we could see that and hopefully give us more information about what may be influencing the scavengers that then scavenged the remains. So that video is up and coming. I hope to work on that soon and release it. Maybe by the time you listen to this episode, it will be released. This is a gentle reminder that if you find this podcast and the information in it useful, please do consider supporting the podcast by donating. You can donate through Buy Me a Coffee or through Patreon. Both platforms you can donate through, and for very small amounts, $1, $5, $10. And Patreon, you can donate monthly or just the one time. It's completely up to you. All the money goes directly to me to support my time, both on the podcast and doing the research. And my time on this podcast and with the research has been significant. I spend a lot of time reading journal articles. I do the interviews. I do a lot of cold calling. And I do also the editing and post-production of this podcast. So if you enjoy this podcast, if you are learning from it, please consider buying me a coffee or joining on Patreon. Both links are in the show notes and on my website, yvonnechorlin.com. If you want to ask me a question, I would seriously love to hear from you. Bring on your questions. Anything archaeology-wise, bioarchaeology, bioanthro, consulting, you name it. Ask me. You can go through my website at yvonnechorlin.com. You can email me at ychorlin@gmail.com. That's YKJORLIEN @gmail.com. Or you can contact me through my Facebook page, Reluctant Archaeologist. I am also on Instagram at Yvonne Chorlin. You can also comment on this podcast through my website and YouTube. Reach out and tell me what you think of the show and what you're learning about dead people. I'd love to hear it. Now here is the interview. All right. So Janet, I'm going to get you to say who you are and where you work in your role, because I don't want to mess it up.
Okay. So my name is Janet Young. I am the curator of biological anthropology at the Canadian Museum of History.
What does that mean that you are a curator? Let's delve into that a little bit.
So a curator is someone who is the subject matter expert for different fields. So we have curators, history, archaeology, ethnology. So there's a number of curators that work at the museum, and our role is to steward collections and work on projects for the general public, work on exhibits. So it's sort of the bridge between the content of the holdings of the museum and the public. It's bringing that information and doing research to add to the public knowledge about a certain subject matter.
Wow. And you've been there a long time.
So yes, I've been there a long time. I've been there 30 years. Now this is one of those things that when I talk to students, I always say, you're not going to get the job at the top right away. So I started as a volunteer after I did my master's, and it wasn't even in my field, but I started volunteering at the museum. And eventually I made my way over to the physical anthropology section. And then I started getting contracts. And so I got a series of contracts for about 7 years. And then they created a position for me. And then I worked in that for several years. And then the curator of physical anthropology at the time retired, and I ended up with his position. So if students ever come to me and say, how did you get this position? It's a lot of sticking to it and not giving up and just doing your best to get your foot in the door and then working your way up. So yeah, it's been 30 years, but as you're trying to work your way into a position, the time goes fast. So it's not so bad.
And what is your educational background?
So I have an undergraduate degree in ancient history and archaeology. My master's is from England, so it's Master's of Science in Human Osteology, Paleopathology, and Funerary Archaeology. And then I came back home and I started working at the museum. And at that time, I did my PhD in population health. And even though it's a subject that is very much modern day and related to modern populations, the program allowed me to work on past populations. So it was a good fit for me at the time. So
Nice. Yeah. Us people in biological anthropology, we always seem to have very diverse backgrounds.
I know, right? Well, you kind of find your way, you find your path. When I first started, when I left high school many moons ago, I wanted to work in archaeology, and so you end up on this circuitous path through different programs. And when I was done, I didn't know what to do. So at that point, there was really no computers. So you went to like the graduate studies center and you started looking through pamphlets to see what was interesting. And I found one on human remains, and that was it for me. That's exactly what I wanted to do. And so, yeah, it just, starts on a path. But I think for a lot of people in archaeology or in biological anthropology, it's a circuitous path to really find what you're interested in. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And I find it's not one of those, I guess, subjects that isn't really talked about, well, in high school, number one. So when you're, going into university and trying to figure out what you want to do for the rest of your life, because, everybody does that when they're 17, they know exactly what they want to do for the rest of their life. And then when you get to university, well, who talks about death and bodies and human remains? Like, it's just,
yeah, yeah, it's like for mine, it was classical archaeology. So it was like,
Mhm.
here's a pot, here's a Roman pot, here's another Roman pot, and here and so I knew very quickly that that's not something I wanted to do. But I did take a death and dying class that sort of like
Ah.
sort of piqued my interest in the subject matter, and trying to understand how that worked, not just now, but in the past as well. So it sort of piqued my interest for that aspect of archaeology that like no one had really introduced me to at that point. So.
Okay, so how did you start working with the Barrack Hill Cemetery?
So it's really interesting. Well, I think it's interesting. So, um, when I was working on another project, someone from down the hall was actually the curator of Ontario Archaeology, um, called me into their office and told me that was I aware of the excavations that were happening in downtown Ottawa. So we knew that there was a cemetery there for a long time, and so I didn't at the time, but someone that we both knew, his office overlooked the site, and so that's who called the my colleague, and so that's really how I found out more details. And then I had worked with the police quite a bit, so I reached out to the head of the ident unit to say, I don't know if you're aware, but there is a cemetery there from the 1800s, and so at that point, I was put in contact with the archaeologist on the site, and we just established a working relationship. And the museum came into an agreement with the city, and so the city allowed it to be my research project, and the museum gave me the time to do all the work. So I was actually down on the site for 2 summers with the excavation crew, and it's very odd when the first site was like in a road, one of the main roads in downtown Ottawa. So you're like below road level, and there's people walking by on the sidewalk, but they're screened off, so you can see like normal life going back and forth, and you're basically sitting in the middle of a cemetery. So I came at it, from, I don't want to say haphazardly, but I was lucky enough to know enough people in and around the area that informed me of this project, and I was allowed to be a part of it, which I really appreciated.
So tell me a little bit about the cemetery itself. So it sounds like downtown Ottawa was built upon this cemetery, And did they know that it was there when they had built up downtown? And then what led to then the excavation of the cemetery?
So what happened was, okay, so it's really an interesting story about how historical cemeteries are used. So when Colonel By came to the region to build the canal, he had a lot of people, an influx of workers. So he came here in 1826. Canal construction started around 1827. So there was an influx of workers. There was really nothing on that side of the Ottawa River. On the other side of the Ottawa River, there was a lumber industry already. But on our side of the Ottawa River, there wasn't anything. So when Colonel Bry came to town, then he started bringing people in. People were hired to do different aspects of the construction. And then there was an infrastructure that came in around these people. So hotels were built and stores were built and stuff like that. So what happened was Colonel By was given the land that Lord Dalhousie had purchased. So it was a bunch of land where Parliament Hill is today and down into Lower Town. Below that area, the land was owned by Nicholas Sparks, who was a former lumberyard worker. When Colonel By was doing the canal, he wanted land on either side of the canal, so he purchased it. But then he also wanted the land below what is now Parliament Hill, which is Nicholas Sparks's land, because they were worried about creating like a fortress or something should the Americans attack again, because it was a byproduct of the War of 1812. So what happened was he took 88 acres from Nicholas Sparks.
He just took it.
He just took it. They passed the Rideau Canal Act that said basically if you need any land for the Rideau Canal, you can take it. And he made the excuse that the land was going to be used as a place to hold water to help with the workings of the canal, which was basically a lie. So he took the land. So in those early days, there was no settler cemetery on the south side of the Ottawa River. People would be ferried over to the other town on the north side, but there was really nothing on the south side. So Colonel By gave or set aside the acreage for a cemetery that was actually on Nicholas Sparks's land that he had expropriated. Okay. So basically where the cemetery was below Parliament Hill on a little like walking path that went from Upper Bytown at the time to Lower Bytown. So it was like right in the middle, and it was right beside a cedar swamp. So it was, so he allowed the cemetery to be created. We really know nothing about the cemetery other than some of the burial records, but we really know nothing. Nicholas Sparks fought to get his land back. So in the late 1840s, he actually got his land back. And so, yeah, I know it was a very long legal battle. He started almost immediately, and he hired a lawyer and fought to get his land back. And so the cemetery was still there, and it's right in the middle of his prime land between Upper and Lower Bytown. So what he started doing was selling lots in and around the area. And then he he sold for a very cheap price land that was used for an Upper Bytown market. And we see little breadcrumbs in the newspaper about he paved this road, or they made this road going through. So the remains were found on Queen Street. So in 1851, I think it was, we have something in the paper saying that they put Queen Street through to the market, which means they put a street right over the burial ground.
Oh.
So we start seeing that, and it doesn't look like the cemetery was ever moved. It looks like people who had money and could see what was happening moved their loved ones, but there was never any formal moving of the cemetery, to the point where in the 1854, around there, People who are poor, who were in Bytown, petitioned the city to pay someone to remove the remains of their loved ones because they were becoming exposed in the area of this road. So we know for a fact that the cemetery was not moved in any formal way. And so the city just built up around it. Like Nicholas Sparks kind of just didn't want it to be there anymore. So they just started, selling off lots and creating all these different infrastructure. And then people just forgot that it was there. Basically, that's what happened. Yeah.
Huh. But it sounds like it was used for what, 15, 20 years or so?
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
It was about, I estimate that it opened in the spring, I think, of 1828, the cemetery, and it was closed around 1843. So not even 20 years.
Right. Okay.
So, yeah. And they said it was 2 acres when closed. So it was pretty big, pretty good, big site.
Okay. And how many individuals do you figure at its maximum? Maybe.
I think the archaeologists thought about 500
Really? Okay.
at the time. And we only have like small pockets of people.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The cemetery was disturbed starting in like the 1870s. So
Okay.
maybe 20 years after it was paved over, people
Okay.
started finding bodies as the infrastructure was being put in. So, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I guess it was just more of a natural urban process to build up over this cemetery.
Yeah, they just wanted it forgotten, which is sad, but it's just a lot of historic cemeteries have the same fate. Take away the headstones and just pave over.
Wow. Okay. So then what were they doing that there was this excavation going on in the middle of the street? And when you got involved, what what kind of prompted all that?
So, Ottawa is putting in the infrastructure for a light rail service.
Ah.
So, which runs now underneath Queen Street. But they were doing infrastructure work, replacing water mains on Queen Street itself. So that area is basically right through the middle of the cemetery. And when they dug to put in the water main, they hit bodies basically. And then they called the police because that's what you're supposed to do when you hit bodies. And it went to the Ontario government. And when it was deemed a cemetery, then the archaeologists that they hired had to go and enter an agreement between the city, the province, and anyone who was identified as a descendant. The Ontario government put an ad in the local paper asking, if you think you are a descendant of these individuals, could you please come forward and speak for them? One person came forward, and she was not sure whether her ancestor had been moved or not. And so in the end, she found out that they had been moved. So she was really not part of the process after that. And the churches stepped in. So the churches who had buried individuals in the cemetery, it was a settler cemetery, it was multi-denominational. So the heads of those churches became the representatives of the individuals. Okay. So it was the representatives, the city of Ottawa, the province, and the archaeology company who came to an agreement, and I became part of that agreement for work on the individuals.
Okay. Yeah. It's no small undertaking to excavate a cemetery.
No, it is not. And I'm so happy that the archaeologists knew exactly what to do and how to do it, because the remains were first discovered in late 2013, but they were not removed, or excavations did not progress until the following summer. So it took over like months to get everything into place.
Yeah. Do you have any idea? I know you came in later in the process, so I don't know if you know this, but um, were they expecting to dig up bodies? Because I can only imagine the poor person on the excavator, just merrily digging away, and then suddenly, what is in my bucket?
I think what happened was the city had done a sort of an archaeological,
Okay.
it's a sort of a report to say if you're going to hit any archaeological sites.
Hmm.
So the city had done that.
Okay.
They were told that there was a cemetery there, but it had probably been moved. So there was no
Okay.
expectation of finding anybody. And so I think it was a shock when they did, obviously. Um, but it's funny because the whole site is crossed with like construction events. So there's like a water main trench, and then there's a trench for Bell, and then Rogers had done a trench line through the site, but they had dug at night. So when they dug at night, they did their trench, they put their cement in and everything. So we were finding human remains on the underside of those cement conduits because they were digging at night, so they didn't see. And so the fact that they were digging in the day and then they find something large enough that is recognizable to a construction worker, um, it was enough for them to stop the process. And then, anytime there's digging done in the area, they have to have an archaeologist on site to sort of watch them. So the excavations at the site were actually the Queen Street one was done one summer, and the archaeologists had a map of the original downtown before there was buildings or anything. And there was one parking lot that had always been a parking lot. It had never been built upon, never been something else. To this day, it is still a parking lot. And so they were thinking, okay, like, this is great. This is one place that's not disturbed. If anything ever happens, we can, excavate full individuals and not just truncated burials. And so what happened was the landowner got a permit from the city, I don't know how, to do a trench for a gas line in the winter of 2016. And what did he do? He went right through a number of burials. And so,
No.
yes, yes, the pristine section. And so that's why there was a second field season in 2016, so 2017, so that that parking lot could be fully excavated. But it wasn't supposed to be, it was just supposed to be the street, and then that happened. It was just, and then what happened? So if that's not, so, and I don't know who's talking to who or if anyone's talking to anyone, but for the LRT, they continued trenching down the road where the remains were found initially, so Queen Street. They kept going down the road, so you're outside the boundaries of the cemetery at this point, all the way down the road, and they were still recovering human remains. And that's because in the 1940s, a water main was put in down Queen Street, and they were taking fill or dirt from the cemetery. And so they were
Oh.
depositing the people, basically remnants of the individuals, all the way down Queen Street. So the archaeologist had, it was something crazy, like 160 dump trucks full of earth that they screened for human remains.
Oh my God, that's a lot.
Isn't that a lot? Isn't that crazy? I appreciate them so much. That's a lot of work. So
Oh, wow.
the remains that we had for study were actually from those three events, and the city is well aware of what's in the area now, and so they are very good about having an archaeologist on site when the construction crews go in to dig beneath the streets now.
You probably know more about that cemetery and about that area than they did back in the 1850s.
It's crazy. It's crazy the amount of information that's swimming in my head about, because it's all a mystery. It's like, why does this happen? And you have to go through and you pull on that thread and you follow that mystery to figure out this or that or the other thing. I mean, and like going through old newspapers, and to me, it's just like so fascinating to try and understand what happened. Like, why are these people left behind? Like, what happened that, the street could be put right over where they were? What happened? Like, so it's all a mystery, and it's one of the, I would say, more interesting thing is to try and see if you can figure it all out. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about some of what you found, because I find it just fascinating, and I'm hoping the listeners will too. Because you've got a blog, Bone Detective, at historymuseum.ca. So if anybody wants to search that, and I find, your blogs contain fascinating stuff. So I was wondering if we could touch on some of them and if you've had some updates.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, there's lots of stories that have come out of the research. And the reason why I was initially wanted to do the blog series, and the museum supported me, which is really great, was because it was ahead of the reburials. And so the remains from that have been excavated have all now been reburied. So it was ahead of the last reburial. And what I really wanted to do is try to bring the people of Ottawa into that history that, they might not otherwise know, and about these individuals. And so I tried to cherry pick some of the individuals who I was able to do a lot of research on, and I had sort of an interesting sort of connection to. And ones that, it's like a blog series is like, what, I don't know, 800, 1,000 words. It's like really short, right? And you're looking at it going, that is 5 years of work summarized in that little space. So, like, one of the individuals, the one that was found to have all sorts of track marks, I don't know another way to say it, on his remains, and then perforations, and then this crusty substance that were in some of these perforations. And, I was able to figure it out, but it took a really long time. You start with, is this something that the body is producing? Is it some form of cancer? Is it something that he was experiencing? What's the distribution? How do I see it? There was not a lot of complete skeletons at the site, and he had one of them, which was very helpful to look for distribution. But so you start down that path, and then you're like, well, what are the accretions? Could it be a tumor? Could it be, something from gout? Could it be? And so you start going through all of these ideas and then running them to ground. And then you're like, nope, that's not it. Nope, that's not it. And so it was really interesting, because when we first did the excavations, I had sent coffin wood off to be identified. And when the identification came back, he basically said, I can't identify it because it's bark. And it was like, what do you mean it's bark? And so I did that. I just tucked that sort of information away. And then when I was studying this individual with all these changes on his skeleton, I remembered about the bark. And so it occurred to me that it could be not something that he was doing, but something that was being done to him. So I actually did a lot of research, and it came, the best solution to this mystery was that it was beetles. So because the bark in the coffins, and I have never found another reference to this. This is the only time, like, there is no reference for this being done at all. And that is Ottawa was a lumber town, or Bytown was a lumber town. And so they were taking the logs and they were squaring them in the mills. So they're taking off the sapwood and the bark and squaring the logs. That sapwood and bark has no value. Even to this day, a whole truck full is $20. It has absolutely no value. Because these people in the cemetery were the lowest socioeconomic status, they were building their coffins out of these squarings. And they're putting the bark side into the coffin, so you wouldn't be able to tell that they were basically the leftovers of the squaring industry. And so what happened was beetles, especially there's certain kind of beetles that were very prevalent in Ottawa because of the lumbering industry. They have a multi-year life cycle. So the eggs would have been laid. They would have taken these pieces and built his coffin and buried him. And then in the ground, the beetle larvae would have emerged, and the only food source was him. And so the track marks and the perforations, it's all, if you look at a log underneath the bark, it's all the same. It's all beetle activity where they're eating the top layer of the bone. And then the perforations are where they are creating their nests. And the accretions that I send off for analysis and no one could identify, they're actually frass. So it's like basically the beetle poop that they used to line their nests. And so that was what was in his bones. And so this is a multi-year process of speaking to like lumber experts, Ottawa Valley experts about the timber industry, speaking to beetle experts from different places in the world, like trying to get all this information. And like all that time and all these years has been put into like a 500-word blog series. But it's so cool, right? It's one of those things where, and that's why I love doing this research. It's just, there's no mention of it anywhere. It's just one of those things that they were just doing because it was cheap and easy, but it wasn't shared widely. It was nowhere in the literature. It's nowhere. And I think that one is, to me, is super interesting. And that's like not the body reacting to it, but actually the beetles creating something on the body. I mean, there's other stories of, identifying what people were doing for a living based on the remains. And one of the main ones that I put in the blog series was the lady who was, we believe, to be a milliner. So, which was another one of those, she was the only one in the cemetery. She's lying on her right side and she had a mat of hair that was, that she was lying on. And so at first we thought it was a horsehair pillow, and I sent the hair off for identification and it came back as human. And so there was a lot of coffin wood that was stuck to it. So I peeled the coffin wood away and you could see the styling. You could see the curls. You could see how it was pulled back over her ear. And so it ended up being her hair. And also within her cranial vault, there was a very soft, like loamy. It's almost like dried peat moss that was inside her cranial vault. And I had it analyzed and it came back as brain. So she was the only one at the site who had preserved brain tissue and preserved hair. And I was working with a scientist at Parks Canada trying to figure out like what is this and everything like that. And then I started noticing skeletal changes on her. And so like I noticed like her teeth had a lot of pockmarks in them. Where I have a tailor from the site. He has the same sort of thing because from holding pins between your teeth, but it wasn't to the same extent. So I didn't think she was really sewing anything. And then she had these changes inside her knees where the ACL attaches, anterior cruciate ligament attaches. And she had some grooves on the inside of her patella. So I knew that she was holding her legs at a 45 degrees to create the grooves in the patella, and that she's pulling her knees together, so seated. And so I did some research, and this is exactly the position that a Milner would take. So the Milner would hold the head form between their knees while they worked on it. So that would explain the skeletal changes. It would explain the dental changes that I was seeing. Um, but like again, why does she have preserved brain tissue, and why does she have preserved hair? Originally, I thought, okay, maybe she was embalmed, but embalming really wasn't a thing during the use of the cemetery. It didn't really become a thing until after the Civil War. And so, but we do know that um, those early embalming fluids contain mercury. And so I was following sort of that thread of things. And early milliners, they were also termed hatters. So, and in sort of Bytown or early Canada, a lot of them were female. It was one of those occupations that females could hold at the time. And they would work with furs to create hats. And working with furs, they would use mercury. And so we know that mercury was used in embalming, so we know that it helps preserve tissue. So I did a bunch of research on the hatting industry and how what they do actually crosses into the body. So she had a high degree of I think it's inorganic versus organic mercury. So it tells that she wasn't ingesting it because inorganic mercury is not small enough to go into the hair. So it wasn't like she was ingesting it and it was being leaving her body through her hair as it grew. That wasn't happening. It was being infused into the hair. And so, and again, with the Milner industry, they would have a lot of mercury vapor. And so it was the vapors that were going into her hair, and it would also cross the blood-brain boundary when they inhale it. So that's why you get mad as a hatter, because they were inhaling the mercury. And so that would explain why her hair is preserved and her brain is preserved. And no one else at the site had it because she was a Milner. And so again, lots of little threads that you have to keep pulling. And so you follow a trail and you get some information that doesn't really make sense. And then you follow another trail. And eventually all those pieces can come together to create a really good story. And so, I mean, those are just two of them. The cemetery was filled with really great stories and things that I don't understand either. So I had a child who had dark circles inside their eye sockets. And so I thought, okay, well, they might have been buried with coins because, you know, the silver as it deteriorates could leave a dark staining inside their orbits. And then I had it sent off for testing and it was burnt. And it was burnt at a really high level of heat. And so these were actually scorch marks, but they were just inside the eyes. So I know it's like, what is that?
My mind goes to strange and disturbed places with that.
I know. And it's, I don't know, was that something that happened post-mortem? Obviously the person wasn't thrashing around when it happened. So is it some treatment post-mortem? What is this? So even though I have some of these mysteries sort of solved, there are still a number of them where it's still like, okay, I have to try and figure this out. But it's a very lengthy process to go through to try and do this. But I feel like for this population, that I want to try and tell all their stories fully. So to me, it's worth the time and the effort to try and really understand who these people were. And so, yeah, I mean, they're mysteries in terms of they're very interesting, but they're also a story that's there from this person. And just to be able to really understand those stories and to tell them for other people, I think is really important.
So on that note, what do you think that learning about these past populations gives us here now? Like, what is the benefit of studying the past, I guess?
I think the benefit is to understand, that as a population or any population, you weren't just sort of plopped somewhere. There's people that came before. There's people that had really hard lives, that worked really hard to get us to a point in history where we are able to have what we have and do what we do. And I think for me, like, I live in Ottawa, a population of 1 million people, just one person, and I have so many stories. So it's the idea that every person has a history, every person has a story to tell. And I think that connecting us to the past through these stories, I think is important to ground us in our history and to be able to, yes, it was Bytown. Yes, they did this. I said they did that. But to say, okay, there was this person here who worked really hard, who exposed themselves to really harsh conditions just to survive, and to understand that those people, like, this is the first settler cemetery of Ottawa. These are the people that did most of the living and paying and dying in this town to create this town, right? They are the beginning of the nation's capital population. And I think that for us to be able to respect them, respect those people in the past, we can only hope that we are respected the same in the future. That we are people throughout time. We've had our challenges, and everyone's story is different. And to be able to connect people today to those stories and understand what was sacrificed for them to be here and to be in this town, I think it's really important. And for Barrack Hill Cemetery, what has happened now is that Beechwood Cemetery, which is the national cemetery, has created a Barrack Hill Cemetery within their borders. And so, and they do tours. And so all these stories that I'm able to decipher and provide them are being passed down to all these individuals who go on these tours and try to understand the history of Ottawa and the history of the working class, even people who are, they're not the people that had the money and had the power. They were the people that, were there every single day working to survive. And so I think it's important that we understand that we came from something, that everything around us was built by somebody else, and that to appreciate that aspect of our lives today.
Right. Yeah, we have a tendency to take things for granted, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to say, yeah, there were others here before us, and they created this. And you're right, we didn't just manifest ourselves here, adults in this city, place, wherever. There were others here before us, and they helped create where we are today.
Yeah. And a lot of kids didn't make it. They went through several epidemics, smallpox, cholera, to create something. So yeah, I think that we're less if we don't understand what we came from or appreciate it even.
Right. So what do you mentioned that the excavation took place in the middle of the street, and you had pedestrians and life going on around you. What was that experience like when you had kind of modern day living people going on, and here you were digging in the ground in the past?
It's surreal, I guess.
Did you have people stop and ask you what you were doing?
No, because it was blocked. They couldn't
Oh,
see.
okay.
There was
Okay.
screens. And then what happened was, after the excavations started, they put up tents. So people, because people could see down from the buildings, because it's right in the middle of downtown Ottawa. So people could
Okay.
see looking down from the buildings. And so they put tents up. So they did not. There was some news articles about it happening, but the general person, and you could sit there and you can listen to people have everyday conversations walking by you, and you're like, wow. I think that anyone would have been fascinated by what was happening, but if you had opened it up, then traffic wouldn't move at all. Like you'd have
Right.
a gathering around, trying to, be a part of it and understand it. So in that sense, it was nice that it was blocked off, but very, really surreal, like really surreal.
And so the remains have been all reburied, I'm guessing, or there's still some undergoing analysis or investigation?
So they've all been reburied. So the ones excavated the first season, so 2014, they were reburied in 2017. And then the ones that were excavated in 2016 were reburied in 2019.
All
And
right.
then we just had one in the fall for the remains that were found throughout the length of Queen Street. So that was the final reburial. So there was 3 reburials, and each is commemorated with a plaque at the new Barrack Hill Cemetery at Beechwood. So,
All right. Cool.
and the city did, like, I want to say the city did an amazing job. They opened the first reburial. It was open to the public. They could come and look at it was held at the museum. They were allowed to come in and look at the boxes. So the city had made everyone a burial box, and tried to follow methods from the time. And so they were all there, and people could come and pay their respects and try to understand more about the history. And then and for the first, second, and third reburial, they got a horse-drawn hearse. So
Wow.
the majority of the remains were, except for the last reburial, were buried before, and then they had like a representative coffin, and that individual was brought to the place of burial in a horse-drawn hearse that would have been representative of the time. So it was really well done. It was multi-denominational, because many different religious groups were part of the cemetery. The city did an amazing job in trying to pull it all together and to give them the respect that they might not have had in life, obviously left behind where they were. So try to restore some of that respect to these people. Yeah.
It's
Really,
interesting in the perspectives because, back in the 1850s, when the cemetery was still being used in the cemetery, the fact that it was paved over or, built around and just wanted to be forgotten, it's a very different perspective from how we treat human remains in cemeteries nowadays.
it's very different. And I don't know what that is. I don't know how that evolved or why. There were early reports that people were using the kids, as soccer balls, the ones that were exposed at the site, right? Because there was a school nearby. And so, I don't know what that is. I don't know how they could have just done that. Now, there's articles in the paper for people who are going, you can't do this. You can't just, go right over the cemetery. You can't leave these people. But it didn't change how things were handled at the time. I think the people that were part of the government of the city were just trying to, they were more concerned about their economics, and they just went and did it anyway. There was a large transient population at the time, so people weren't really that linked to the past as much as I think now. But I'm amazed. I'm actually just amazed at that. But we have it to this day. We have it. We have old burial grounds, old historic burial grounds that are now parks, right? So, I mean, a generation after Barrack had closed, there is an area in Ottawa called McDonald's Gardens. And anyone who was moved from Barrack would have been moved to McDonald's Gardens. It became the next major multi-dimensional cemetery, and denominational, multi-denominational cemetery for the town. It's a park now because they removed the headstones. Some people were moved to Beechwood, others weren't. They removed the headstones and they made it a park. And so it's the same thing with downtown Kingston. There's all these old burial grounds that people just removed headstones and just use the space as something else. And people don't know that. Like, it's not part of the general knowledge of the people that live around these spaces a lot of the times. It's just a historic view that, people are not aware of. And so, yeah, I mean, I appreciate the fact that we've evolved into making them parks and not just digging up the bones and throwing them somewhere. I mean, that's an evolution in itself. But we would never think of doing that at this day, right? There is
very different.
Yeah, strange.
Yeah. Well, I'm conscious of the time, although I would love to talk to you just for hours on this. It's so interesting. Just one last question, and it's kind of off on a tangent, but I wanted to know that if you could go back and visit your younger self, like 20, 30 years ago, what would you tell young Janet that, I don't know, you would appreciate now?
I would tell her to enjoy the process. I think a lot of times you're fighting so hard to advance yourself and to try and get things done and do things that you don't enjoy the evolution of your skills and the evolution of your knowledge, and you don't enjoy it's situations that you have to try and get through, as opposed to appreciating them and enjoying them for what they are. And I think that for me, that would be the one thing that I would go back and say, relax, just enjoy what you're doing and appreciate it. And I think that that's the main takeaway for me.
Oh, lovely. Janet, this has been a delight. Thank you very much for coming on and talking about yourself and the Barrack Hill Cemetery.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope I didn't babble too much. I have so much information in my head. So thank you for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Please leave a rating or review and share this episode and podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues.